those who have heard me talk before, the message is very similar because we still have a lot of work to do. There is a lot of work has been done. There's been a lot of organizing. There's been a lot of activity by the district and by residents and by agencies that control the lands that surround the district. However, it took us a long time to get into the situation we're in right now. It took a long time for the heavy fuel concentrations to develop, and it's going to take a while for us to get out of this. So really what I'd like to do is talk in 3 acts here, as Ira Glass likes to say. The first will be to talk about what the threat looks like. And what we're really talking about is a wind-driven fire during the fall months coming out of the north or northeast, so specifically out of the Briones watershed area, down into the Lamorinda area. That's the fire scenario we're going to talk about, and we'll explain that a little bit. And along with that, just a little explanation of the science of how fire behaves. One of the challenges I found as I give my talks and I try to build awareness is that very few people have experienced a wildfire firsthand, and as a result of that, imaginations take over, and there's an idea that every worst moment of every fire you've seen on the news or in a movie or in a documentary or whatever other source, that becomes a surrogate for how fire is going to behave in our district. And there's a little more to that. And the good news is that worst case scenario that many residents are imagining is in fact the true worst case. And there's lots of shades of gray between a worst case scenario and no fire at all. And there's an awful lot we can do to prepare for those smaller fires, the non-cataclysmic fires, where we can make a real difference in what the threat profile is and how much risk our community is exposed to and how that risk is categorized, specifically by insurance agencies. So I do think with the work that is being done with the partnership with residents and community organizations and surrounding agencies, I do think we have a real path to making this better. And that I think should give us all hope. And then hopefully that will translate into a call for action, which is the next part, which is the what you can do. And we'll talk some specifics about what you as a homeowner, some very simple, low cost, high return on investment steps you can take to reduce the threat and the risk to both you and your neighbors. And then some things that once you figured it out for your home, what you can do to try to convince your neighbors that it's a good idea as well. And then lastly, which is certainly related to the fire problem, we'll talk about evacuation and how you can prepare yourself for evacuation, how you can sign up for the different systems that are used to control evacuation, and how you and your neighbors can do some grassroots, ground up organizing so that you and your neighbors are better prepared for the event of evacuation, and you have some degree of resiliency built into the system in advance. Because quite frankly, if we are in the throes of a large scale fire that's going to require the evacuation of major portions of the community, our systems are going to be overloaded and overwhelmed, and we're not going to have strike teams of hundreds of ambulances coming in to move people out. There's going to be a requirement for neighbors to help neighbors, for people to help themselves, and if there's just a modicum of preparedness has been done, that task becomes much easier. So without any further ado, let me try to master technology here to share my screen, which is always a moment of great uncertainty. Let's see what happens if we do that and that and that. Okay. All right, so what we're looking at here on the right side, over here, you see an outline of, with a legend color coding them by year, of all of the fires that we have map perimeters for in the greater Bay Area. You'll note that there's quite a few in and around Mount Diablo and over on the flanks. And on the left side there, you see a blow up of our specific area. And right where that green squiggly line comes through from high on the right to low on the left, that's Highway 24. And if those of you who were here in 1991, you note the large green amoeba looking thing, that's the tunnel fire. Up above it at the heel is the 1970, the fish fire that burned right at the intersection of Fish Ranch Road and Grizzly Peak up into Oakland and resulted in a number of losses. And if you go just a little bit north of that, you see the 1923 Berkeley Hills fire, which at its time was the most destructive fire in California history. And that burned up and out of Wildcat Canyon and down really into the Gourmet Ghetto portions of North Berkeley. So really down off the hill. And the thing those 3 fires have in common, which were the 3 defining fires of this area, is that all of them occurred in the fall months in conjunction with a Diablo wind event, which is characterized by very dry, relative humidity conditions, moderate temperatures, and sustained high winds, and a breaking of the inversion layer that brings those winds down into alignment with downslope topography. So what we see there is essentially all of the dry air that sits up in the Great Basin. When it flows out, as it does in the fall and winter months, that sets the conditions for explosive fire growth. And those are the same conditions that we saw the 2017 North Bay fires on the Atlas and Tubbs. Those fires were driven by those same Diablo winds. Last year in the Kincaid fire, same thing. The year before on the Thomas fire down in Santa Barbara, where they call them sundowners, the same basic phenomena. And if you look at how those fires performed and what the final fire perimeter for 1923, 1970, 1991, it's this big sort of amorphous shape. And those fires, they went out when the wind stopped. They burned until there was no more wind to drive them. And then they basically stood still. They started retreating back up slope, and firefighters were able to get a line around them. And the one I like to point out is if you look just below the 1970 fish fire, and just to the right of where it says 1991 on the tunnel fire, you see an unnamed 1937 fire in sort of a light purple. And it's running from west to east in an ellipse, a very long, narrow shape. And in 1937, I can promise you, there were not hundreds of highly trained firefighters with state-of-the-art equipment that were able to get a line around that fire and prevent it from spreading. And what that fire was an early season fire. It ignited right along the mid-slope or so of the Oakland Hills, and it burned up and over the Oakland Hills into about Sibley. And that fire went out pretty suddenly. And it went out so suddenly that it never had time to spread and become a big awkward shape. And the reason it went out so suddenly is that the fog came in. And a big wet blanket was put on top of that party, and the fire was put out by nature. And so the reason I offer that up is we have seasonal winds all spring, all summer, out of the west, every day. As the temperature imbalance between the inland areas and the cool ocean develops, the hot air inland rises, cold air from the ocean rushes in. And with that cold air, we get high winds. And every afternoon, sometime between about 4 and 7, depending on how far to the west you live, the fog comes in. And when the fog comes in, the relative humidity climbs very rapidly and sits somewhere between 80 and 100, depending on what elevation you're at. And within 1 hour of that fog arriving, the 1 hour fuels, the light flashy fuels, the grasses and the weeds and the things that will carry a high intensity fire very, very quickly, they have stabilized with the ambient moisture in the environment. And when they surpass 11% moisture, fuel moisture, as in they've uptaken enough water from the air around them that they have reached or exceeded 11% fuel moisture, those fuels will no longer burn. They've exceeded their moisture of extinction, which for 1 hour fuels is 12%. So I offer that up to say, while there could be a fire coming from the west, and there was one in the late 80s in the Lost Valley area where some fireworks were set off, they landed below some homes up on Crestview, they burned rapidly up the hill and burned 5 homes. And while 5 homes is a terrible loss, and that was certainly a significant fire, that's very, very different than the catastrophic fires we have seen in the fall in this area and seen in the last several years up in the North Bay, where it's a Diablo wind event characterized by those very dry, very high winds out of the north and northeast. And the reason I offer that explanation is to say that the fire we're really worried about, and we're worried about all fires, but the fire that we're worried about, the community erasing fire, is going to be a wind-driven fire coming out of Briones. And you see here, you see Briones Reservoir and the San Pablo Reservoir, and Bear Creek Road runs along the north of Orinda, and here's Highway 24 running down the middle of the community. But these red arrows indicate the direction that we typically see Diablo winds come. They're either north or northeast. And those winds are going to drive a fire potentially out of the wilderness areas of the Briones watershed and drive it down into the community. And that's why the district, working in partnership with CAL FIRE and CON FIRE and East Bay Parks and East Bay Mud, built the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break last year. And we are currently in the process of maintaining that fuel break through the application of prescribed fire, to include tomorrow morning when MOFD firefighters are going to burn out a section along Happy Valley to reinforce the line and prevent the reestablishment of annual grasses and weeds and help reduce the regrowth of some of the brush that we ground up. We've been carrying that out throughout the spring. We'll continue to carry it out through the month of June before we fall out of prescription and unable to burn anymore. But this fuel break, the shaded fuel break that we've constructed, while I'm very proud of the team and the work they did, and I'm grateful for the state support, and we continue to seek out additional opportunities for state funding to expand and extend this line around the rest of the community, this fuel break is only going to stop one component of fire, and that's the ground component of fire. That's the element of fire that travels from species to species, from item to item, in a direct manner, direct flame impingement from one tree, one brush, one section of grass to another. And when the fuel bed is interrupted and there is no medium to carry the fire stops. Fire can't just magically transport itself across open space. It has to have an uninterrupted fuel bed in order to burn. And if you look at the second bullet of item 2 here, the second element we're talking about is three-dimensional ember cast. And this is the flaming brands or embers, the sparks, if you will, that are produced by a fire and can travel miles in front of the flaming, of the main body of fire. And when they land, if they land on a receptive fuel bed, on a pile of dead leaves, on a gutter that's choked full of tree duff and litter or pine needles, or dead grass that hasn't been mitigated, or unbroken rosemary or juniper, or any of the other fire-prone plants that we are concerned about, those embers can create fires in their own right. And those embers can travel up to miles in advance of the main body of fire. In the case of the bark plate off ponderosa pine, which have many of the same aerodynamic shapes and characteristics as an airplane wing, those things can travel miles in advance of the main body of fire. Last year on October 27th, when we had a major fire day in the district, there were fire jumped the Carquinez Strait. Fire burning above the marina in Vallejo established a new fire south of Crockett. And if you've ever driven that or driven it recently, I think we can all agree that's a pretty good section of pretty good distance for an ember to travel. My personal guess, I don't know, I didn't see it, but it was probably a tumbleweed or something else like that would support fire for a long time. And the winds were so great, they could maintain the velocity aloft to carry that thing across that large open space. But the point of that is to say that the fuel break, well, as I said, I'm very proud of it and I appreciate all the hard work that went into it and all our partners. That fuel break will do nothing to spread three-dimensional ember cast across the community. And every time one of those embers lands, if it lands on a body of water, on a parking lot, on gravel, on well-maintained landscaping, on a maintained fire-resistant roof, then no harm, no foul. That ember doesn't do anything. It just goes out with a sizzle if it's water or without a sizzle if it's something dry. But if it lands on a receptive fuel bed, if it lands on that pile of brush or the grass or the tree duff and litter, it creates a new fire. And it's not possible, except in some science fiction future we have not approached, where there will be swarms of ubiquitous drones floating everywhere chasing these things down. It's just not possible for us to have a firefighter in every yard stamping out these embers as they hit the ground. And that's why it's so critically important, as we'll talk about a little later, that everyone does fuel mitigation work and prepares their homes to create that defensible space and to harden the home against an onslaught of blown embers traveling in advance of the fire front. Back to the first slide, I apologize, I got slightly out of order there. The fire is normal for this area. The pre-European contact, this area burned every 3 to 5 years. Up in the foothills, it burned every 20 to 25 years, moving up into the forested areas of the Sequoia, or of the Sierra. But as I was saying, that since fire is a natural element of our environment, the native species are adapted to be fire dependent in some cases. Oak trees, they're spread out. A well-maintained recurring fire landscape has a mosaic of fuels that support the profusion of native flora and fauna, and they become very resistant to fire because you never see these huge accumulations of combustible material. And so because the fuel loading is not that high, when fires occur on a regular basis, they're low intensity and they don't burn with the flame lengths and the fire line intensity that we saw in the North Bay fires that start to kill trees and damage watersheds. They just burn in the understory and they clear things out. However, starting around 1900 or so, we began systematically excluding fire from the landscape, but we replaced it with cattle. And so for a long time, we stayed in an equilibrium where cows wandered around and ate the grass that was no longer being burned. But as our community was built out, really culminating in the 1970s, we also excluded cows, and we didn't replace them with anything else. And at the same time, we filled the landscape with non-native species. We planted large numbers of Monterey pines. We imported eucalyptus trees. We planted juniper in response to the droughts of the 1970s. We put in bamboo and rosemary and other fire-prone species that we then allowed to grow to create the semi-rural character that draws people to this community. And something has got to give at that point, because after we did that, after we excluded the natural items that reduce or maintain fuel loads, and we inserted all of these non-native fire-prone species, then we planted homes and humans and lives and critical infrastructure that we have to protect into this landscape, where as we excluded fire, we did not exclude photosynthesis. And so that the fuel bed just continues to accumulate, and plants continue to grow and to die and to deposit combustible material. And we have to do something. And for a long time, we didn't do anything. And I think the fires of the last several years have fundamentally changed our concern about the topic. They've generated a tremendous amount of public awareness of the problem. And really, they have set the stage where we can do something. And the good news is, if you look at item 3 there, is that we know exactly how fire spreads. There is not a need for a great deal of study and investigation. Well, we could always do more, but we have a very good idea of how fire spreads. We have a very good idea of how to build houses that will not burn. And we have a very good idea of how to combine those so that we have fire resistive, ember resistant construction and defensible space, which will slow or stop the spread of fire. It will set the conditions for an orderly and efficient evacuation of the community. And it will buy precious time for firefighters to respond in to fight the fire, and residents to evacuate out to protect both their lives and to give the firefighters the space they need to make an aggressive fire stop. And the good news is these things aren't particularly complex. There are 3 things that contribute to fire spread, and 3 things only. And the first is topography. When the topography and the weather get into alignment, i.e. when wind is running upslope, when either canyons or valleys or draws funnel the wind to increase its velocity, that absolutely, it's a known fact when topography and weather interact, how that can increase the intensity of the fire. And weather, obviously, in our area, primarily, our fires are wind-dominated fires. The controlling element to their spread and their spread rates is the wind and the relative humidity, which is associated with fuel moisture. And then the last element is fuel. And of those 3, I don't think it takes a whole lot of study to figure out that fuel is the one that we can control. The topography is what it is. We cannot change the terrain, and we certainly cannot change the weather, but we can change the fuel. And the great thing is, if you remove one of those 3 elements, we disrupt the continuity of the fuel bed, and we eliminate the conditions that fire needs to spread rapidly. So what we're doing in the district to try to address these concerns and the community concern and our understanding of the threat the community faces and our understanding of MOFD's responsibility to help prepare the community to face this issue, we've come up with a wildfire prevention strategic plan. It's available on our website under prevention. It's a clearly marked tab when you get on the website. And it's broken down into 7 lines of effort. And so the first one is external fuels mitigation projects. This is things like the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, which was executed with $4.25 million in state funding. I think in the current environment, it's reasonable to assume that's not something we can count on an annual basis. However, we continue to seek out innovative opportunities to both reduce the cost of the work, to seek external funding to pay for that work, and to use fire science and fire modeling to make sure the work is being done in the most efficient manner will generate the greatest benefit to the community as far as reduced fire risk. The second issue is internal fuels mitigation projects. This is us working with major landowners, the city and the town, with some of the large undeveloped parcel owners, with East Bay Mud and PG&E around their infrastructure inside the community, and with residents like you who own parcels, and doing the work on those small parcels and getting your neighbors to do the work and getting organized into fire-wise neighborhoods. Those are the ways that we can reduce the number of internal islands that are choked full of combustible fuels that create that receptive fuel bed that a blown ember can find and start a fire behind us. The third line of effort is wildfire pre-planning. If we have a large-scale fire in this area, we are going to have hundreds of firefighters from throughout the region in our district in a very, very short period of time. And if we have a plan, and if we are organized to receive, direct, and account for those firefighters and do that seamlessly, we will increase the efficiency of their operations, and we will reduce fire spread. So we have and will continue to stay engaged in that. And really the linchpin of that particular plan is heavy and ongoing participation in the mutual aid system. We currently have an engine with a Contra Costa strike team up in Solano County on the Wildfire. I'm with them. We also have another engine going out with a strike team heading up to Stanislaus. So these are opportunities for our firefighters to go out and learn from other people's fires, so that when we have a big fire in our district, it's not the first time we've seen something of that scale, and we're not relying on distant oral memories of the 1991 fire to figure out what we should do. So we're out aggressively engaged in this program. We're learning on other people's fires, and we're building the relationships and the experiences and the qualifications that will be critical to controlling a very large fire response in a very short period of time. Item 4 is evacuation planning. If we can get everyone out of the community, one, we give ourselves a much better chance of putting the fire out, because it's much easier to fight fire when there are not a bunch of residents trying to get out or trying to help. I will tell you, as a firefighter, when it's smoky and there's a lot of wind blowing and things are moving fast, the absolute scariest thing is not the fire. It's a resident in their car barreling down the road who can't see anything and has no idea that you're there. That car is very, very scary. And when there are still large numbers of residents in the area, it absolutely slows down the firefighting effort. So we're committed to making sure we have a plan. That plan is coordinated and integrated with the police department, and at the county level with the community warning system, and at the state level, to make sure we can execute an orderly and efficient evacuation through a common operating picture, shared terms and terminology, and a regular exercise of the system to make sure that fire to law, law to CWS, CWS to the community, that all of those systems are regularly exercised and working. We're in the final planning stages for a community-wide evacuation in Orinda in July, with another one to follow in Moraga. This is a virtual evacuation exercise because we have no intent to put the entire community on the road, but it will exercise all of the parts right up until you drive your car out of your driveway, which is probably the easiest part of the evacuation and the hardest part to simulate. So we go through all of the other steps to make sure the system works and to iron out all the bugs to make sure that when we attempt to tell the community it's time to go in a time-phased and deliberate manner that allows those who are closest to the threat to be evacuated first, that when we do that, that all the downstream things will work in the manner we expect them to, because we have exercised them and we have a degree of certainty that they work. Item 5 is building code updates. This is an ongoing process that we have been working through with the city and the town since December. We anticipate having a first reading of the proposed new fire code before the MOFD at our board meeting next week. And we hope that that will lead to adoption by MOFD and by the city and the town. It's intended to be a progressive fire code. As I mentioned before, we have a very good understanding of how to prevent fires through building construction. We have a very good understanding of how to slow or stop the spread of fires through the development of defensible space. And the building code reflects that understanding, those best practices. And we are hopeful that it will be adopted in the near future. With regard to vegetation management and defensible space, that would not take effect until next year. We're pretty far into this year to have a shift sometime in July or August to tell people they need to go do something else. Item 6, which this is a part of, it's one of my favorites because it's a lot more fun than hunting and pecking at my keyboard trying to type. The community outreach and education. We have gotten a tremendous amount of positive feedback from the community. We have learned a lot from things the community has shared with us about things that work, things that don't work, their personal experiences, elements we had not considered because we were not looking at it from a resident perspective. So we'll continue to engage in community outreach and education, because if we have a great plan and no one knows about it, or we have the absolute best fire science captured in our fire code, but no one's doing it, well then all we've really done is admire the problem. So we continue to remain engaged in community outreach and education. And then lastly, working with some of our tech partners and some UC Berkeley faculty who happen to be district residents and trying to tap into a real emerging interest in wildfire amongst the tech community. We've been working a number of innovative measures for early detection and notification. All fires start small, and the sooner we know about the fire, the faster we can get to it. The faster we can get to it, the smaller the fire is, the fewer resources it takes to put it out. The campfire, as an example, that devastated Paradise, That began at one point, it was 6 inches by 6 inches. And had someone been right there when that molten material fell off that PG&E equipment, they probably could have stomped it out with their boots before it ran off and became this devastating force of nature. So we're committed to continuing to try early detection and notification. Anytime you're trying something new in this space, there's stuff that works and doesn't. And we're working our way through that. Last month, we were able to, while conducting prescribed fire on Wildcat Canyon, we used ground-based sensors that we developed in partnership with Splunk and ADI to detect a fire, which then triggered a notification to a satellite from Planet Labs, which was able to get satellite imagery of the fire, which then could lend itself to all sorts of things, because the satellite not only tells us there's a fire, but it gives us the perimeter, and the satellite's able to capture video, which it can rapidly downlink, which allows us to take a look at flame length, intensity, and spread rates, which then get dropped into a fire model, produces an automated fire model showing 1, 3, and 5 hour spreads overlaid on top of evacuation zones that then give an informed evacuation decision support tool, giving us a common operating picture that police and fire can use to say, okay, this is where the fire is now. This is where we believe the fire is going to go. And these are the evacuation decisions that should flow from that to move the elements of the community with the greatest risk out. So that's just a way of saying these are the things that we're working on, and we're going to continue to work on them, because this is a problem that's not going away anytime soon. And until we are able to wrap our heads around what it means to address these issues, we're going to continue to struggle to defeat them. So the last thing, oh, I went off screen share too soon, I apologize. Here's one last thing I'd like to show you. This is the CAL FIRE maps showing the fire hazard severity zones for our area. So on the left, you see the county. You see that Briones up here, this is the red, sort of shaded out. That's very high fire hazard severity zones. And the light orange here, this is high. So those are things that are considered dangerous. And then if you look over here where you see the breakout, you see large portions of North Orinda are either very high fire hazard severity zones or high fire hazard severity zones, as is most of Central Orinda down until you get pretty much down to Miramonte, and then large portions of the southeast and of the northwest of Moraga are as well. And these maps were dated from 2007 in this particular map. New maps are coming out. We anticipate the new maps will show a significant increase in the areas that are categorized as very high fire hazard severity zones. And we continue to work with the MOFD board and with the city and the town to adopt the most progressive fire code we can to reflect the reality of the fire danger we face here by virtue of our proximity to the wilderness areas of Briones and our exposure to those fall Dob low winds. All right, let's close that. All right, so that's what we're doing. And that's what we've done to try to organize the problem. That's what we've done to work on the areas that would be hard for an individual resident or homeowner to do. And that's how we're trying to shape the broader community-wide response. So the next part is what you can do, because while we can mess around with satellites and all sorts of other things, what we can't do is go out onto your parcel and reduce the accumulation of combustible fuels in proximity to your home. And we can't come into your home and prepare you for an evacuation. And we can't come into your home and sign you up for the community warning system. These are all things that you can do. And so what we're doing is we're trying to do the things we can do, and to make sure the education and the outreach has been done to the things you can do. You're aware of them. You've got a pathway to understanding how it can be done. In the case of the chipper program, that you have a partner in the form of the district that comes in and helps to unlock some of your ability to reduce fuels. So let's talk about the first thing, which is the most important and it's the most timely, especially given that the district's annual requirement for exterior hazard abatement or fuels reduction is coming up on the 15th of June. And so what that means for every resident and every parcel in the district, if your parcel is less than an acre, you need to abate the entire parcel. That means any annual grass and weeds, the stuff that grows up every year is green through the spring, and over the last couple of weeks has turned either golden if you work for the California Chamber of Commerce, or brown if you're a non-colorblind human being. All that brown stuff that is growing needs to be cut. It needs to be cut to less than 3 inches. For bonus points, after you cut it, you should rake it up, but that's not a requirement. Because what you're doing then is you're taking those light, flashy fuels, those things that will support rapid fire spread rates and high fire line intensity. And when you lay them flat, when you change the configuration of that fuel bed from vertical to horizontal, you reduce the surface area, you reduce the exposure to drying winds, and you reduce the amount of air that can circulate around that fuel to allow it to burn. So standing grass fire will rip through there, putting off 10 to 20 foot flame lengths at spread rates of up to 500 feet per minute. On the other hand, when you lay it flat, having cut it, you now, the same amount of fuel, but the fuel isn't available. It's able to uptake more moisture and hold that moisture from the fog. So we reduce the time of day during which it will burn. And if you rake it up, now not only have you changed the configuration, but you've physically removed it from the environment. And fuel that's not there can't burn. And a fire cannot burn without fuel. And a stubble field, unlike those long flame lengths and high spread rates we see in standing grass, a stubbled field burns much like mulch. 6 to 12 inch flame lengths, spread rates in the 10 to 30 feet per minute, very, very slow, very low intensity, much easier to control, much less damaging as far as the potential threat it faces to your house. So that's the first thing. And the good news is with a weed eater, that's quick work. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. That's required every year and has been for a very long time. The second thing is to take a look at your roof. And over the winter, and again in the fall, this will happen, tree duff and litter and pine needles and those sort of things fall and accumulate on the roof, specifically in the valleys and in the gutters. And as remember we talked about before, that receptive fuel bed, anytime an ember finds a collection of dead, dry, combustible material, it has the potential to start a fire. Well, if that fire is sitting in a valley of your roof or sitting in your gutter, you've just welcomed fire into your home. It doesn't matter what else you've done, doesn't matter what we have done to create the fuel break, how much defensible space you've created. The fire now has the potential to ignite either on your roof, where it will find a vent and gain access to the attic and then burn the house down through the void spaces, or from the gutters, where a fire in the gutter, remember the roof, that roofing material is designed to overlap, to hang over the gutter and allow water to run off. The fire works in the exact opposite manner of water. Where water falls, fire rises. So the very systems that are engineered in your house to shed water from the exterior will act to pull fire in. If you allow fire to become established in the gutter, around the base, up underneath the trim, near the vents, all of those things will pull fire into the home. And if there's fire in a void space on an event of the size we were talking about, the firefighters aren't even wearing the right protective equipment to go in and make the stop, and they don't have enough resources, they don't have the time, they're just gonna keep driving. On the quail fire up here yesterday, in a neighborhood that saw relatively mild fire behavior, and there were no losses. There was one loss, and that was a big, beautiful home surrounded by xeriscaped gravel, a lot of asphalt that had been laid in a nice manner. All the trees around there were trimmed up. The grass was all cut down, and that fire 100% burned that house to the ground. And my guess is that's because there was an accumulation of tree needles from the pines that surrounded it on the roof, and an ember found it. There's no other way that it was plausible that that house burned. It had a tile roof. I mean, all of the things you would say would make this fire resistant. Yet that house has now been burned, and a family is now trying to pick through the pieces of what was their dream home up on a hill in Solano County. So it's really important that you get up and you clean out those gutters and you clean out those valleys. And it's important that that happens again in the fall. This isn't a once a year event. In the fall, when we're exposed to diablo winds, that's also the time that many trees are dropping things. We have high winds, which tend to cause them to accumulate on roofs. And that is a very important, high value, low cost step of maintenance you can take to reduce the potential for fire loss by eliminating receptive fuel beds that are lying on your roof. The next step is to take a look at the accumulation of combustible material right next to the house. So if you have a pile of leaves surrounded by gravel 100 feet from your house, that can burn all day long. I don't think anybody's gonna care. It's gonna be an isolated little pile of leaves burning a long way from the house. And there's nothing there for the burn. Fire, that heat's gonna vent up to the sky and it's not gonna spread to anything. On the other hand, if that same pile of leaves is pushed up against your house, it's next to a vent, it's next to the weep screed behind the stucco, it's able to access a seam in the siding, that will allow the fire to communicate into the void spaces. And behind your stucco, behind your siding, behind whatever your house is clad in, there's a layer of tar paper, which is literally paper and petroleum products. And it doesn't take a whole lot of fire to get paper that's been soaked in petroleum products to burn. And if that paper that's been soaked in petroleum products is the underlayment behind your wall, the fire is just going to follow that up the wall into the attic. And once again, your house is now going to become fully involved. So the next step we want to do after having maintained those valleys and gutters, much of that combusted material, which will have now blown off and will be sitting next to your house, is do the same thing around the base of the house. Take a lap of the house and take a hard look at what combusted material is there against the house. Is there blown dead leaves that have accumulated there in the eddies where the wind swirls? Is there dead grass? Is there combusted material, the high decadent component like rosemary? Some sort of a drought-tolerant brush or other plant species that if you reach up, many of the branches and twigs will break because they're dry and dead. Beautiful green boxwood, as an example. If you have boxwood, reach underneath it and take a look. More likely than not, you're going to find you have 4 to 6 inches of dead leaves and other things underneath that boxwood right next to your house. So you really want to take a hard look at what combustive material and receptive fuel beds do you have right against the base of your house, and you want to clear those back. The next fire code is going to propose requiring those to be cleared back by 2 feet. I think that's a good number. That would include mulch. Mulch can burn, generating 4 to 6 inch flame lengths. If you have 4 to 6 inch flame lengths lapping against the base of your house, there's a much higher likelihood that your house can be consumed. And after you've done that and the stuff in immediate proximity to the home and the stuff in the gutters and the valleys, then you want to work your way out from the home, creating defensible space. And so now in the perfect world, and if you ever come visit my house, you will find my house is surrounded by gravel. One, because, well, it'd be a little awkward if my house burned down. And 2, if there's a big fire, I won't be there. I'm going to be in the district. And so I thought to myself, okay, how do we create the passive measures that whether someone is here or not, there will be no likelihood that blown embers will land and create a fire. But I also accept that landscaping exclusively with gravel, while tremendous from a fire spread perspective, is just not realistic. And so I want to be crystal clear. It won't break my heart if you landscape with gravel alone, but that's not a requirement. But I would ask you to consider pulling back the mulch and the other combustive ground cover to create some space so that there's an interruption in the fuel bed. It makes it easier to maintain leaves and other things that blow in there. It reduces the chance that a low intensity fire can creep through that ground cover and deliver direct flame impingement to the exposed under portions of the siding where that tar paper is. And it decreases the likelihood of a fire loss. But so what we want to do is we move out from that zone immediately adjacent to the house where we'd like to see a removal of all combustive material. As you move out away from the house, you want to thin. So an isolated planting of something is probably not a problem, especially if it's been limbed up or trimmed up, if it's a tree or brush, so there's an air gap. So there's a space between the ground or anything in the ground that can burn and the lower portions of the canopy. So that you remove and you break up those ladder fuels, those things that will allow a low intensity ground fire to climb the ladder, if you will, into the canopy of the brush or the trees or anything like that. We want to see thinning, so breaking up into islands. So juniper is certainly not our favorite, but an isolated juniper plant surrounded by nothing else that will burn is not of great interest. An entire hillside covered by juniper is of very great interest because if that gets a fire gets established in there, we won't be able to put it out. So it's really a matter of thinning and creating that defensible space, and think of it as a hopscotch game. If you were fire and you were trying to hopscotch through this yard, are the gaps between the things that will burn great enough that fire cannot bridge that gap, that the hop of your hopscotch game is too long? And there's endless opportunities to do creative landscaping and to integrate native plants and all sorts of other things. It's just all about breaking them up. So we don't end up with these heavy overgrown concentrations of fuels with a high decadent component that don't allow you to get to maintain them because it's so thick. And so really that's the overarching view. The specifics, we would like to see trees trimmed or limbed so that there is at least 5 feet between the lowest portion of the canopy and the ground or anything growing underneath it. So for a normal sized person, that means at the drip line, you should be able to walk a lap of your tree without hitting your head on any of the low hanging branches. They should be trimmed up above your head. If you're really short, hold your hand up. If you're really tall, duck down a little bit, but about 5 feet, and absolutely more is better. If you trim that tree up higher, that's 100% better. We would also like to see any elements of the tree that overhang a house, that we have at least 5 feet of vertical separation between the roof and the canopy, and 10 feet from any stovepipes or chimneys to the trees. And then lastly, we would like to see any roadside vegetation. So the combustive growth that's overhanging the sides of the road. We would like to see those cut back. The fire code requires 3 feet back, 15 feet up from the edge of the roadside. And that's really for two purposes. One, I think as anybody who has ever done the morning commute, back when there was such a thing, will tell you, we know that our surface street capacity will not support mass movement of the community at the same time. And we know that our streets are already too narrow for the goal of moving everybody. Yet those same streets are made narrower at points where encroaching vegetation on the shoulders grows out over the road. If you're a cyclist, it's those areas where you have to swerve out in traffic to avoid being clotheslined by the tree branch, right? So one, that reduces the width of the road, which is not helpful because we need every inch of roadway that we have to get fire engines in and residents out. But also a road, a paved road, asphalt for our purposes in wildfire will not burn. So a road becomes a fire break, an area from which fuels have been removed or eliminated that will slow or stop the spread of fire. Well, I think we can all understand why that's tremendously useful as we try to prevent a fire from spreading throughout the community. But its effectiveness is really a product of flame length, which is driven, among other things, by fuel loading, by flame length, and then width. And when the width of the road exceeds the flame length, the fire will not cross that road, at least not the ground component. But when we have encroaching vegetation on the sides, it's doubly bad. One, we have heavy concentrations of fuel that now lean out over the road, which reduce the effective road width, meaning the fire is more likely to blow across and continue. So we would really like to see an emphasis on clearing back your roadside vegetation. So on one hand, start at your house, do the things that will make your house harden the home and create defensible space. You can consider swapping out the vents for either Vulcan vents or Brand Guard or other vents that prevent ember intrusion into the home, clear off the vegetation on the roof, create defensible space, starting with a removal of all, if you are able, combustible material within 2 feet of the home. So do that for your house, which is great. And that reduces the likelihood that your home will burn. For you and your neighbors, do the roadside vegetation clearance, because that roadside vegetation clearance, not only does it create the effective fuel break, but it proofs the evacuation routes that we're going to move you and your neighbors. And while you might not benefit from that because you're getting on the road right there, everyone upstream of you will benefit, just as you will benefit from the work of everyone downstream of you. And the last point I'll make about the fuel mitigation stuff. One, if any of these terms are confusing or it didn't make sense, there are a bunch of very short videos. We're calling them quick hits. They're designed to be watched on a phone, and they're about 30 seconds long, that explain what a ladder fuel is and how to remove them, explain how to take out annual grasses and weeds, and really try to give both you as a resident, or if you have someone else doing the work, you can show them the video and say, hey, do this. And the video, it's very hard to misinterpret or misunderstand. There's no dry language, so I'd encourage you to take a look at those. But this way we can reduce the fuel loading, we can reduce the exposure to risk you and your neighbors have, and starting on the 15th, MOFD is going to be out aggressively enforcing the fire code, specifically on the roadside. And so we're going to have quite a few folks out doing the work to find out who is non-compliant, to educate, outreach, inform, make sure they know what work is required, and then come back to inspect that the work has been done. And if it hasn't been done, then to move forward with the citation process. We are absolutely 100% committed to voluntary compliance. It's a tremendous use of limited district resources to write a citation. We'd much rather have those folks out running the chipper program or doing other things that are actively reducing the fuel loading. But there are also people who aren't going to do the work unless they're cited. And we would really hope that those who know, and hopefully by the time we're done tonight, that's all of you, you will know what the requirements are. You'll have been armed with those videos with some understanding of how to do the work. And then we really hope that you'll go do it because we would much rather spend our time working with willing partners to run the chipper program and do all the other things that we do rather than spend that time doing citations and enforcing the fire code. Okay, so the next thing is evacuation. So you've done all that work, you've prepared your home, and just as a note on evacuation, the default location, the place that you and your family are going to ride out a major fire if everything else falls apart. Public safety power is shut off, the cell phone system is down, your phone was on do not disturb mode, the tower fell, whatever the case may be that prevented you from getting a timely evacuation order and being able to evacuate. that makes your home the default location from which you're going to ride out the fire. And all that work that you can do to create defensible space, that increases the survivability profile of you and any other occupants of that home. So there is a very clear nexus to how you can increase your preparedness by creating defensible space and reducing receptive fuel beds around your home. That said, we hope to be able to get you notified and out of the community in the case of a large-scale fire. And the way we're going to do that is through the community warning system. It's run by the Contra Costa County Office of Emergency Services, which is part of the Sheriff's Office. It's very good. It's funded by the refineries that continue to release things they shouldn't release, which caused, one, the system to be activated, and two, the system to be well funded. So we have one of the best systems there is. It's well funded, which is not normally the case, and it's exercised on a regular basis, which is also not normally the case with evacuation systems. If you have not registered for that yet, I would encourage you to do that at www.cwsalerts.com. It takes about 30 seconds to register, and when you register, you're affiliating your cell phone number and your email and the ability to receive a text with your home address. As crazy as it may sound in this day and age, we know your address, and we have reverse 911, which means if you still have a landline, we can call that landline. But we have no way of knowing where your cell phone lives. We have no way of doing targeted text messages. And Nixle and some of the other mass communication devices are just not the appropriate answer for a large-scale evacuation. Because when we do a Nixle or we do a WIA alert, that's a very blunt instrument that notifies everyone within a community. And if we tell everyone in the community they need to evacuate, we have just demonstrably increased the problem. We have taken you out of inherently fire-resistant home that you may have hardened and prepared for wildfire, and we've put you into an inherently combustive car in a traffic jam. We've done you no favors if we give the entire community just sort of a blanket run for it. So instead, we do time phase and targeted evacuations where the people who are closest to the fire are notified first so that we can get them out. We can flow them out before downstream people who are at less risk and who are farther from the fire before they clog up the roads. But for us to do that, we need to be able to reliably reach you. And the CWS and the submitting and registering your cell phone number and the ability to receive text to that number, that's how we do it. And if you have multiple phones in your house, as if you and your spouse or loved one and your kids or anyone else who's in the home has a phone, you should sign them all up because these things are imperfect. During the Merrill Circle fire, during a public safety power shutoff, in an area that has reliable or notoriously poor and unreliable cell service, a large number of those residents, the call went out, they just didn't get it because their phone was off or there was no coverage or whatever the case may be. So the more phones that are in a home that are signed up, the better. The more ways we have to reach you, the better. Please sign up, please do it tonight, and then please get all your friends and neighbors to do it. Because if you receive an evacuation notification, that pebble, if you will, it made it through. And when it hits the pond of our community, we're hoping that a ripple will spread. And when you're notified, you'll notify your neighbors. And your neighbors will notify their neighbors. And the more people who are signed up, what you're doing is you're hedging the bet on whether or not your cell phone gets called or whether or not you are notified. Because if your message doesn't get through, but your neighbors does, and you and your neighbors have all talked about how you can share evacuation information, well, then you've gotten notified. And the fact that it happened to be from your neighbor instead of the CWS, I think we'll all figure out how to look past that once you're safely evacuated. So we encourage you to sign up and encourage all your neighbors to sign up. It's very beneficial for you and your neighbors. The next thing is to talk to your neighbors and develop some bottom-up resiliency and a little grassroots organizing. Is there a neighbor who can't make it down the stairs? They can drive, they just can't get down the stairs, they need help. Well, who in the neighborhood can help them get down the stairs? Or is there a neighbor who doesn't drive? Someone in one of those cars that's evacuating is going to have an empty seat. And the ability of the fire department and emergency medical services and the police department to move resources upstream against evacuation traffic and start evacuating people in a vehicle that's come from somewhere else, that's just not realistic in the initial phases of a large-scale fire. On the other hand, if a neighbor can help neighbors, and there's resiliency and redundancy there so that the neighborhood understands who's going to need help and is prepared to mobilize to help them, that is the absolute most surefire manner to help move those people out of harm's way. And the last point on evacuation is, if you have multiple cars, please just take one. We know that the roads will not support everyone going. Well, if you take 2 cars, you just doubled your impact on the road. If you take 3 or 4 cars, you tripled or quadrupled on a road that already wouldn't support it. So if you're evacuating, please take just 1 car. please give some thought to what you need to take with you. If you have a bunch of things that are important to you, those should either be stored somewhere else or they should be packed in advance. If you haven't done that in advance and you have from the top your loved ones, your car keys, your wallet, and your cell phone, it's time to go. It really is, when an evacuation order is issued, that is not the time to start thinking about what you want to take. A wildfire in this area that is going to trigger an evacuation is going to be a wind-driven fire, and it's going to be characterized by rapid spread rates and extreme fire behavior. This is not a fire up in the foothills where warning is going to come out that, hey, in 2 days the fire is going to be here. We just don't have fires like that in this area, and with the resources we're going to throw at, the battle is going to be won or lost in a matter of hours. And if you get the evacuation order, it is time to go right now. So I would ask that you give some thought to what are the things you couldn't live without, that you absolutely had to have, and either have them prepared, ready to go right now, store them somewhere else, or just come to grips with the fact that that thing might be getting left behind. Because there is not time to spend some time gathering things up and trying to come up with a plan. This is something you should think about in advance. And if you haven't, or you don't think it's worth your time to think about in advance, then I just ask you to wrap your head around the fact that it's just those basics that you can grab as you would grab as you're going to the store or on another short errand, so you can get out of the house right now. Okay, so that's really, as we come right up on the hour, that's really the high points I wanted to hit. I would say in summary, please, please, please prepare a defensible space and reduce the prevalence of receptive fuel beds around your house and on the roadside that fronts your home. There are resources on the MOFD website under the prevention tab, including a number of short videos that explain how to do that. For fuel mitigation at the home and defensible space, that specifically means clearing duff and litter from the valleys and gutters of your roof, cutting annual grasses and weeds to less than 3 inches by June 15th, breaking up or thinning and removing non-irrigated wild brush, and then irrigated brush, things like rosemary with a high decadent component that are very combustive and fire prone. Trimming or limbing trees to create at least a 5-foot air gap between the canopy and the ground or ground fuels. Removing any dead or dying trees. Those are always a fire code violation. And clearing back that roadside vegetation so it's 3 feet back, 15 feet up. And sign up for the community warning system. Encourage your neighbors to sign up for the community warning system. And talk to your neighbors about organizing a community evacuation plan, a community evacuation, either phone tree or knock on the door notification tree in case phones are out. As I'm sure everyone is aware, public safety power shutoffs have not gone away. They'll be back again this year, and there's a very good chance that we'll be doing all of this in a power degraded environment, which complicates everything. With that, I would really like to thank Duncan and Julie and the other members of the CERT leadership for the invitation, the opportunity to come talk to you tonight. Thank you all very much for participating. We're doing everything that we believe we can, and we really, really, really need your help. And we really appreciate you taking the time to tune in and to try to get a little smarter about how we can solve this problem.
Thank you very much, Chief. Are there any questions? You'll have to unmute yourselves to ask any questions. And just go ahead. I see John raised his hand. Go ahead and mute yourself.
Yeah, this is John. I was wondering if there's any thought given to using goats to trim and the underbrush.
Okay. Yeah, so the question is about using goats. We are agnostic how people reduce the fuels. In my mind, the only good fuel. Goats are also tremendously expensive. They run between $3,500 and $4,500 an acre. They're hard to find because everyone wants them. And from predation, coyotes and mountain lions, which drive costs up in our area. So there's nothing wrong. There's also nothing wrong with a weed eater. There's nothing wrong with a scythe. There's nothing wrong with prescribed fire like we're going to be using tomorrow. So really anything that reduces the fuel, we're in absolute 100% support of. Dan, I don't think you're getting through, Dan. I can't, I can see you talking, but can't hear you.
Dan, your sound isn't working. If you want to send a chat, I can ask the question for you. But
I've just muted everyone because we were getting some horrible sound quality. Would you please chat and we'll read the chats and answer.
Now I'm unmuted. Okay. The community warning system is it's CWS, www.cws alerts.org, and I'll pull it up right now. Or .com. I'm sorry, cwsalerts.com, and it's coming up right now. Here we go. Let me share that. All right, so here's the CWS, the homepage. You see right here it says registration. You can either click there, or you can just scroll. Oh, they moved it. All right, sorry, you go to registration, and then there's a red triangle here, or thing that is looks like a rectangle with rounded edges. You click that, and it takes you through to a Google form, and you enter your name, your email address, and then next it'll show your cell phone and a couple other pieces like that, and all that information is loaded up. And that's what we're going to use for the virtual evacuation exercises coming up here. And it's the way we notify people. Nixle is an interesting way for the police department to tell you school's back in session and drive slow in the fall, or that packages are being stolen from people's front porches around Christmas. So Nixle is not how we're going to be issuing evacuation orders, primarily because we can't control it. It's a blast to the entire community, and with CWS we can target it to one polygon or evacuation zone at a time in order to execute a time-phased and prioritized evacuation. There's a question about so two questions here. One is about moss. Moss in itself isn't necessarily that big of a problem, although the problem becomes if there's moss growing on your roof, how many other things are going to be entrained there, and how much of that moss is going to be dead, and how moist is that moss going to be by late November when it's been 7 months since the last recorded rainfall. So to me, moss is concerning, not as so much from a fire perspective, but more indicative of a lack of maintenance of the roof. And if you're getting up there and you're blowing it off and you're getting the tree and duff and tree litter out of there, there's not going to be any moss growing. So moss always becomes concern about what else has been accumulating up there in those nooks and crannies. Second question about leaf guards. Leaf guards are great if they're working. Where leaf guards become problematic is when they're not maintained and they start to degrade over time, and you get tree litter underneath them. And so now you've got combustible material you can't get to. So it's really a trade-off. A leaf guard means you probably don't need to go up as often, but when you do need to go up, it's going to take a lot more work to get all that stuff out of there. The advantage of an open gutter, if you go up with a leaf blower, you just blow it all off, or put on reverse mode, you just suck it all out of there. And if you have access to those gutters, then it's probably fine not to have them. So the question really becomes of what kind of house. If you live in a 3-story house on a downslope lot, and it's 40 feet from a steep slope to get to the back edge of your roof, and you're not ever going up there, then a leaf guard on your gutters makes a tremendous amount of sense, because you're not going to get up there all the time. If you live on a flat lot in Sleepy Hollow with a 1-story ranch, and you got a teenage kid who likes to jump up there because he's bored and he's been at home for a couple months, then you probably don't need it, because you send him up every week to clean it out. At least that's what I would do. Or I wish my teenage kids would do that. So yeah, I think the question of leaf guards is really one of how often you're getting up there, and how accessible is the space. Let's see here, moving down this list, CWS can be tested. We test it regularly. We did full-scale evacuation exercises of the Moraga Country Club in December of 18, and in North Orinda, 1,500 homes from Sleepy Hollow, the Downs, and Upper Minor. in January of 2019. We learned an awful lot from that. We've recently run a virtual evacuation exercise in the Bluffs and Bollinger, which we learned a lot from that as well. We have another one scheduled for the Moraga Country Club, and then we're doing a community-wide one for all of Orinda in July. And we'll follow that up once we figure out what worked and what didn't from that. We'll follow that up in either late July or in August with a all of Moraga virtual evacuation exercise. And what that virtual evacuation exercise will consist of is outreach and education and advertising to encourage people to sign up for the CWS. Last I looked, we were in the high 30s as far as the sign up rate. So call it close to 40% of the community had signed up for CWS. That's much better than the county average, which is about 13%, but it's a long way from 100 where we would like to be. So once people are signed up, then on the morning of, we will push out time-phased evacuations utilizing a evacuation decision support tool showing modeled fire spread for 1, 3, and 5 hours. We'll use that as an evacuation exercise to increase the information sharing between fire to PD, PD to CWS, and then CWS will push out prioritized evacuation orders to the affected zones with several iterations of fire spread followed up with a blanket one for everyone else to make sure we exercise the system. And then that opens up a survey where people can say, hey, I didn't get a notification. I thought I was signed up. And that's where we find out where problems are. There was an error of transcription or a spelling error or whatever the case may be. So we'll continue to work that forward, and we'll get better at it. Let's see, from the top here, I think I'm at the top. Okay, lavender, yes, lavender is combustible as it gets older. Young lavender that hasn't been planted for very long is just fine. But over time that develops a combustible decadent component and should be trimmed. It doesn't need to be taken out, but you want to trim it up and you want to break up the concentrations of it. If you have a hillside covered in lavender that has not been maintained and has got a high decadent component, that will absolutely burn. Clumps of lavender that have been maintained and well irrigated, not as great an issue. Next question was about dead Monterey pines, and is there a deadline for removal? Yes, when it's dead. All dead or diseased trees need to be removed. It's a fire code violation. If you see a dead Monterey pine, please send us a picture and an address, and we will absolutely send them a letter letting them know that they're in violation of the fire code and they need to remove those Monterey pines. All right, what mulch or ground cover is acceptable for slopes? So mulch is fine. I assume we're talking about soil stability and preventing runoff. Mulch is fine. Anything like that is fine. We just don't want it near the house. So as I said before, if you take a look, if you Google University of Nevada Reno mulch study, they did a great study about the combustibility of mulches. And I'll save you about 10 pages of reading by saying shredded western red cedar, otherwise known as gorilla fir, is the absolute worst. Don't ever use it. If you do, I will consider a personal insult. It's very combustive. It blows around. It can accumulate. Even if you don't have it near the house, by the time the wind picks up, it'll spread. It's got lots of surface area. It's really bad. On the other end of the spectrum is partially decomposed, sort of composted kind of ground cover, which burns, but not with any intensity. But the point is that all of them burn, and on average they put off about 4 to 6 inch flame lengths. And so you can use mulch out away from the house and out in areas that are more isolated. You just don't want it leading right up to your house, because what you've done then is you've created a ladder fuel. In this case, it's a horizontal ladder fuel that will deliver the fire directly to your house. And if you were home with a garden hose or the shovel, you just scrape it back and you put the fire out. But you're not going to be there. You're going to be evacuated, I hope. And if a firefighter was there, they wouldn't even grab a tool. They would just stomp it out with their boots. But the firefighter's not going to be there because they're going to be up on the ridge fighting the big fire, trying to prevent it from coming into town. And so it's really important that we create those passive measures that in the absence of you being there or a firefighter posted in your driveway, there's something to prevent that fire from spreading. On the Merrill Circle fire last year, we were very fortunate. It was a pre-positioned red flag fire weather day. We had pre-positioned strike teams throughout the region. We rapidly got about 120 firefighters on that fire in very, very little time. And we literally put a fire engine in every driveway on Merrill Circle. But that was also limited to about 30 homes that were on the backside, and we happened to have that many engines. And we had 4 bulldozers that we used to run a ring around that thing so it wouldn't spread anywhere laterally. And we were able to put a firefighter in every engine, and they just waited for the fire to come down. And when it hit the stubble where the homeowners association had done some mowing, then they just put it out. Easy peasy. Had we not had an engine in every driveway, that fire would have slowly worked its way through the mulch, would have gotten established into the plantings and the wood fences and all the other things that are there, and worked their way to the homes, and we absolutely would have lost some homes. So it's not a safe assumption that we'll be able to put an engine in every driveway with 14,000 parcels in the district. So it's very helpful if you create some passive measures. And one of the ways you can do that is to eliminate or reduce the use of combustible ground cover in close proximity to your home. All right. There's a question about evacuation routes passing through sort of a tunnel of trees. Sorry, I moved down here. Overhead that turn the road into a tunnel. 3 foot back, 15-foot height are there. It's a simple size, the 50-foot trees. Yeah, so Wesley, to your question, if those trees are properly maintained and there is, and the ladder fuels are broken up that would allow a fire to climb up into the canopy, fire doesn't just become established in a tree canopy. It has to have a pathway that leads it into it. And so one of my favorite tricks, I won't try to do it here, but when we're done, for anyone who disagrees with me, I would challenge you to, first of all, to a dunk contest. And then after that, my second challenge would be that tough crowd. Okay, so if you, just for fun, if you look up a picture of paradise, right? I think we've all seen pictures of the devastation of paradise, right? And an entire community wiped off the map. And when you first look at those pictures, in the foreground of every one of those pictures is a burned house, a burned out car, the shattered remnants of someone's life. And that's what we look at. But in every one of those pictures, if you look in the background, look away from the structure in the foreground, look in the background, you will see trees, lots and lots of trees. And you will note that the upper portions of the canopy of every one of those trees is intact. The fire never ran through the canopy. It was a ground fire. Right? So they had 50-foot flame lengths, but the scorch height was less than 5 feet on those trees because those 30 to 50 mile an hour winds laid the fire flat and it raced through the understory. It never climbed into the trees. So the same thing applies here, where the dynamics were not in a conifer forest like they're up there. We don't have the same exposure to winds. We don't have those massive drainages that define the area around Paradise. So the conditions up there, both from weather, topography, and fuel, were demonstrably worse than they'll ever be in our community. Yet even under those extreme, horrific, once-in-a-lifetime fire conditions, the fire never climbed into the canopy in a conifer forest, which is more prone to supporting a crown fire run than the Oak Bay mix we have here. So the trees are obviously hard to miss. The fact that you're going through a tunnel, I'm sure, is disconcerting. But from a fire spread, that 3 feet back, 15 feet up, and reducing or eliminating the ladder fuels that will allow fire to climb, that's where the greatest bang for the buck, return on investment, is doing that work. It also, very helpfully, is much easier to accomplish than taking out large numbers of mature trees. Okay, so question about Lafayette. Lafayette is protected by the Contra Costa County Fire Protection District. It's not part of our jurisdiction. MOFD, under contract with Lafayette through Dennis Rain, supports the Lamorinda CERT program that Duncan and Julie and many others here are involved in. So the fire behavior things that we're talking about, those are universal to the entire community. We spend a lot of time making sure that Chief Aldrich from Lafayette PD is involved, because any evacuation in Moraga or Orinda or Lafayette, they're all interrelated. The conditions that would trigger one evacuation are very likely to trigger the others, and we all share the same roadways. So it is outside of our jurisdiction, but we do do quite a bit of coordination and engagement with Lafayette PD and with COM Fire to make sure we're all on the same page. Okay, shred or mow oak leaves. I would shred or mow to break them up. That would encourage the decomposition. It would reduce the surface area and reduce the likelihood they would burn. It would also reduce the likelihood they would blow. You could also rake them up and compost them or dispose of them otherwise. Removing large eucalyptus and Monterey pine. The question is, removing large eucalyptus and Monterey pine is really expensive, but sounds like a good thing to do. Will there ever be programs like those that help fund energy upgrades for moving very large old trees? Never say never, but I think it's very unlikely that there will be wide-scale funding for removal of Monterey pines and trees inside the community. From time to time, the district and other agencies around us have gotten large grants to remove, federal grants to remove eucalyptus stands. Specifically, there's work going on right now above Grizzly Peak between the steam trains and Fish Ranch. That's federally funded. There was also a monster, an $8 million federal grant given in the 90s to remove eucalyptus, or early 2000s, to remove eucalyptus in Claremont Canyon. That was blocked through litigation, and that work was never done. So large-scale removal of trees is very problematic. It's very expensive, and it triggers litigation that has stopped projects of that scope and scale. From our perspective, as long as the tree is healthy, tree removal is pretty low on the list for healthy, vibrant trees. What we would like to see is that trimming or limbing to bring up any portions of the canopy that are low to the ground, and then the maintenance of the duff and litter that they deposit on the ground around them to reduce the availability of ground fuels. Next question is there a CWS for Alameda County? There is. It's called AC Alerts, and it has the same basic function as CWS. It's just not exercised as often because they don't have the refineries, and it's set up slightly differently, but it really, the principle is the same. It's just provided by a different vendor. Redwood decks attached to or near your home, is there a way to make it combustible? Redwood is, generally speaking, is fire resistive. That said, and dimensional lumber is not as great an issue during a wildfire. That said, anything that has been curing in the sun for years and years is going to be more fire prone. However, just like we talked about with reducing fuel beds and combustive material, the same thing applies to decks. A deck that's covered in pine needles or has needles choking the gaps between the deck boards, or has combustible material stored underneath them, that deck is much more likely to burn. So a deck by itself that's freestanding, that's well maintained, and is not surrounded by combustible material, it's very difficult for embers to light dimensional lumber. You would typically see those being ignited by direct flame impingement, and that means there has to be a receptive fuel bed and then an unbroken fuel ladder, if you will, that'll bring the fire to the deck. Let's see here. Who do you send the uploaded pictures of the dead trees or dead Monterey pines to? That would go to info@mofd.org. Gordon Graham is our fuels mitigation manager. He has for those of you who participate in the chipping program, he has the very cheerful fuel mitigation specialist working for him, and they will come out to take a look at it. And where do you suggest storing fuel for generators that we'll need for power outages? Tom, I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer on that one. Small gas motors and storing significant amounts of fuel for them make me very, very nervous. The right answer for power shutoffs is either a natural gas generator with a permit that's appropriately installed, or some sort of a photovoltaic system. Generators and the fuel that's stored for them can cause real problems. If you are doing that, I would recommend storing it in approved containers inside a flammable materials locker far from the home. And that's not something you want. Either the fumes, the vapor, the refueling, all of those are problematic. I certainly understand that it's hard to live for extended periods without power, but small gas motors do require a lot of care and feeding. And I would just ask you to please follow the recommendations specific to using flammable liquid storage containers for those. Coordinating with Lafayette PD, Chief Aldrich is involved in our planning meetings for the upcoming evacuations. They've done some similar things, and we make sure that we're sharing lessons learned with them, that they understand what we know, and that if we're executing an evacuation, it's done in coordination with Lafayette, so that we don't have a whole bunch of people make it out, say, out Moraga Road, and suddenly discover that the lights are all flashing the wrong way and there's a traffic jam. So we understand that anyone who's evacuating out that way, or anyone who's getting on the freeway, is going to move through other communities. And we want to make sure that the downstream roads are prepared and that coordination is occurring. That happens all the time anyway. Moraga, Lafayette, and Orinda regularly flow police department resources back and forth across the border or borders to help each other out. Next question was, should we shut the gas off to our house? Shutting the gas off in the event of a major evacuation is always a good idea. However, in the case of a wildfire evacuation, I would much rather that you leave rather than take the time to go find the wrench and to turn the valve. For wildfire, the only time natural gas becomes an issue is after the house is burned down, and then you have an open gas butt, and it doesn't actually really cause any problems. It's just sort of a flare of gas shooting in the air, and we don't do anything about it. The worst thing we do is put it out, and then you'd have a bunch of uncombusted gas floating around. So that's shutting off your gas is not a priority in a wildfire evacuation. I would encourage you to just rapidly evacuate. And yes, we're working with Moraga Country Club specifically about revitalizing the block captain process and evacuation exercises, and have shared recommendations about what fire safe landscaping looks like and how they can reduce the accumulation of heavy fuels on the south side of the country club, where it interfaces with the steep slopes leading up to Indian Valley. The question is, what do we recommend for people in HOA communities with heavy fuel accumulation in some areas? I recommend you talk to your HOA and encourage them to reduce those fuels. There are HOAs, the Orinda Downs as an example, they spend moving up close to the 6 figures on fuel mitigation every year. And they have, as a community, they've taken up a special assessment that is paying for this. Everyone recognizes that work needs to be done, and they are paying to have that work done. So really, when it comes to an HOA, obviously, if you identify there are areas that need to be worked, we encourage you to work with your HOA. If that work's not occurring and there's a violation, you certainly can submit a complaint, and we can go out and issue a citation. That said, issuing citations is really, really low on our list of things we would choose to do. We really are driving for that voluntary compliance. And if you as a resident are aware of the need, I'd encourage you to attempt to reach out to your neighbors and to the HOA and see if it can be resolved at the lowest level. As I said before, there's 14,000 parcels. The MOFD board has made a significant investment in fuel mitigation, created new positions, but still we've got 4 folks. And those same folks are also running the chipper program and doing a lot of other outreach and education. And we're not ever going, there's no scenario in the foreseeable future where I can see us reaching 14,000 homes. I do have one just kind of thing to add for that, and it will be out very shortly as we roll out the new fuel mitigation citation system. It'll have a self-report feature. So you as a resident, if you've done the work and your house is ready and great, take some pictures, you'll load it up into that system, and that'll let us do a virtual confirmation that yes, you're good, and then we can put you in the system as in the green. That's got a couple of advantages. You know, if the time comes that your insurance agent decides that you're too high risk, you can say, look, I've been inspected and passed. It also prevents us wasting the time to come out and look at a house that you know is already done. That's a tremendous waste of everybody's time. And so we encourage everyone who's done the work to self-report that work so that we don't have to come out and spend time looking at something that's already been done. It's just not a great use of the resource. Okay, last question I see here is East Bay Mud on board and ditto for regional parks. So East Bay Mud owns an awful lot of watershed that surrounds the district. They own a lot of land. They don't have a whole lot of resources. They're a good partner of ours to the degree that they can be. I will say from my perspective, they are not resourced for the level of work that is required. For residents who do live in those perimeter areas around the periphery that are in close proximity, that's a lot of P's, to East Bay Mud lands, I would encourage you to reach out to your East Bay Mud director. You all have an elected director on the East Bay Mud board, and let them know that you think this should be a higher priority and they should put additional resources into it. That is a problem there is no top end to how much work those areas would absorb. So I don't think anybody in that organization would say that they're doing enough or too much, or that there's any risk that no matter how many resources they put towards the problem, that they could ever have over-resourced that problem. East Bay Parks is a very, very large organization with an awful lot of land and their own organization and systems. We continue to try to maintain a good working relationship and move forward some of the problems or some of the issues that have been brought to our attention, specifically fuel mitigation in some of the park areas that surround the district, and maintenance of fire trails. That continues to be a challenge, but we continue to work with them to try to improve those issues. Yeah, so you do not send your self-report to info@mofd.com. You send it to the fire prevention software, which is in the process of being rolled out. That's not ready yet, so I can't give you a website. As we approach the 15th and as that comes online and gets turned on, that information will be very, very available. on the MOFD website. I would encourage you, as we get closer to the 15th, check with that website. It'll be under announcements, and it'll be very clear, because we would love to have you do the work of inspecting your property for us, and we could really use the help.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chief, and thank you everyone for attending. The recording of the meeting will be posted on the lamorinda.cert.org website tomorrow morning. If you go to the meetings page, at the bottom of the page, it will show tonight's meeting, and over on the right-hand side on the bottom line will be a link to this video. Thank you all, and I hope to see you next month when we hear from Les Putnam from PG&E. Good night all.